This week on Cool Story, we are talking about Bridie's brush with fame, Hadrian's event calendar reaching through the centuries, and the devastating illegal and legal logging happening in Australia.
I'm Bridie Jabor.
And I'm Bri Lee.
So what have you been up to this week, Bri?
Well, I would like to thank our listeners who slid into the Cool Story Instagram DMs to recommend that we listen to the episode of the If Books Could Kill podcast about atomic habits after how much we hated on it last week. And we could and should have hated on it so much more.
Vindication.
Yes. I feel incredibly vindicated. That podcast episode, holy smokes. They just skewer it. It's like a post-mortem operation of how bullshit that entire book is. They even debunk some of the stats and sort of anecdotes and research that
amazing.
That the author relies on to really make his points. This is James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, that we shit-talked last week. But also they even go into detail about, and I hadn't even thought of this myself, how the diagrams he had throughout his book often don't actually communicate anything or like don't plot actual data, and how so many of his arguments are like tautologies. And it was just, it was chef's kiss, no notes. So if you listened to our episode of Cool Story last week and enjoyed how much we hated on Atomic Habits, you should absolutely go and listen to the Atomic Habits episode of If Books Could Kill.
Great. Well, and thank you to all the listeners who sent it in, and we'll put it in the show notes as well.
Yep. And on this note also, Bridie and I were looking at how many lovely reviews and comments people have been leaving, especially on Apple iTunes. I'm not an Apple person.
Apple Podcasts.
Apple Podcasts for us. We would like to thank everyone who's given us 5-star ratings, and I would also like to thank the one person who gave us a 1-star rating. I don't know what your intention was, but we had a good laugh. So thank you.
I kind of wish they'd left a review, and I really appreciated the review that described this as deranged chats. So thank you.
Beautiful. You've had a big week.
I've had a huge week. I could go into so much. I went home and saw my family for my cousin's 50th and 40th.
This is to Grafton?
Yeah, to Grafton. My family is so funny. They're just so big and so funny, and I almost feel like they're kind of a superpower of mine. We're all so different. Some of the most naturally funny people that I know, and I had a great weekend with them.
Oh, that's so nice.
It was great. And then I came home and have a highly unlikely and highly unrelatable anecdote.
Unrelatable as in unusual, and we will not be able to relate.
Yeah, like I don't think it's going to be happening to many other people.
Okay, all right.
I went to dinner with an English friends of ours, a couple who were visiting. Took them to Bush in Redfern, which if you're ever in Australia if you're ever in Sydney is a great restaurant, and it's all, native, a lot of produce and meats that are native to Australia and just delicious. So I thought it was a cool place to take my friends, and we arrived and walked in and sat down at the table, and I said to my friends, "That's Hugo Weaving." And they were like, "What?" And he was seated at a table kind of across from us, and I thought, oh my God, I've given you your like celebrity spotting of your trip. I've taken you to this great restaurant and now we've had a celebrity spotting. And they're like, oh my God, so cool.
Did you go up to him and ask him if he was Annabelle Crabb?
Or was he looking at me thinking maybe I was Annabelle Crabb?
Sorry.
And so my friends were like, amazing. And we're looking at the menu and deciding what to order. And then I hear this voice yell out, "Bridie." And I look across and it's Holly Greenwood, who I think was away from the table when I walked into the restaurant. And she's an artist in Sydney who I've met once and had such a fun night with. I follow her on Insta now and really love all her work. But she remembered me, and she's also Hugo Weaving's daughter. And so she beckoned me over to the table, and I said, hi, hey, Holly. Oh, my God, it's so great to see you. We had a great chat. And she's like, this is my dad. And I had another friend and I said, yeah, I know. And I didn't play it cool at all. I was like, yeah, we were just at the table saying, oh my God, there's Hugo Weaving at the other table. And now you've called me over. And he was so nice and so friendly. And we just had a friendly chat and told Holly it was great to see her and went back to the table. And my friends were all just like, what the hell, Bridie? You walked in and spotted him. We all saw him. And then the next minute you're at his table chatting. And I said, oh, yeah, just so unlikely and so funny. And then because I had said at the table, oh, my God, we were just saying, I said I clocked you, Hugo, and we were just saying, oh, my God, Hugo Weaving's over there. When he got up and left, he came over to the table and leaned over and said, bye, Bridie.
What an MVP.
Yeah, he's so cool. And I think he did it on purpose to make me impressive in front of my mates. It was so funny.
If this was a rom-com, that would be the scene where you're like trying to impress a date. And it's like just there's this like sort of boppy inspirational music in the background and you're like sliding on through with a wind machine blowing your hair.
Yeah, the funniest part was I clocked him and I just never thought that I would be called over his set. But the funniest part is I don't actually know him, so I wasn't like building it up for my mates. I never thought I'd be called over, but I'd met his daughter before. Anyway, so that was my week. I also read 2 great books this week.
And I haven't heard much about either of them, which is very, frankly, exciting for me.
So I instituted a new rule this year in my reading where I thought I cannot read another novel where someone gets an email or a text message. I do not, and I think when people do it, they do it well. It's not me thinking that they shouldn't be in modern books. Of course they should be. They're part of modern life. But I get so many emails and text messages. I don't want my escapism in a book. I don't want to read other people's emails and text messages. I'm just so over it.
Bridie, you're not going to be able to read my novel.
No, I will for you. Or maybe I'll be past my distaste, but for months I have been reading, the only novels I've been reading have basically published before the year 2000 or set in a different time.
Yeah.
And I've been having a great time doing it. It actually is perfect escape. And this book got loaned to me by a mate. It's called The Group by Mary McCarthy. I'd never heard of it before. She'd just had it in her house and said that I would like it. And that looks
like a very old and well-loved copy of a book.
Yeah, yeah. I've got to give it back to her because it does properly look like she loves it. It's all yellowed pages and like curled edges and all that. So this book was published in the 60s and it's set in the 30s and it's about a group of female friends. And it seems to be one of the first books, or maybe one of the biggest books for its time, about female friendship, and seems to have influenced an entire canon that we know today.
Wow.
So the person who introduces this edition is Candace Bushnell, who wrote Sex and the City.
I was just about to interrupt you and say, is this the origin story, the secret origin story of Sex and the City?
It's the secret origin story of Sex and the City, and it's a group of female friends who meet in college, and it follows them over like the 7 to 10 years after college in New York City. And as they all go about their lives in New York City, and they met in college at Vassar, and, you know, they all had big dreams and big hopes, and then it follows them along as their friendships wax and wane. They get closer to each other and drift apart, and life turns out differently for some of them. It is a great book, a great read, really, really well written, but it's also just so extraordinary for its time. You know, this was published in the 60s. There's quite a lot of sex in this.
Cool.
There's commentary about sexual assault. There's tons of stuff in it about mental health.
Wow.
Which blew me away. And mental health in this incredibly empathetic, real way, like what it's like. Like the people who have mental health issues aren't just, you know, depressed or crazy. They're fully formed characters where their mental health issues are just like one aspect of their characters and doesn't make them unlovable or weird.
And so just to reiterate, this was written in the 60s about people in the 30s.
Yeah.
Because I feel like everything we get told about those like earlier times was that nobody talked about that stuff and nobody understood it, and that
even in the 60s, I'm surprised
Yeah.
to be writing about sex in this way in the 60s.
Yeah.
And surprised to be writing about mental health in this way. It is such a brilliant book. These characters are so fully formed. There's also like queer themes in it.
What?
Yeah.
Okay, what is sex in the 60s like?
Well, it's a sex. What was sex? Well, it's set in the 30s.
Oh, right, yeah. What was
So I guess sex in the 30s was like, it was a lot of women in their early to mid 20s losing their virginity in their early to mid 20s and having their first sexual experiences there. And like a woman, you know, going to get birth control. The birth control elements are really interesting and what birth control was like for them.
Yeah.
And the embarrassment of going to the doctor or not going to the doctor and pretending you're married when you go to the doctor, how you pick your husband. The sex depicted in it is just, yeah, kind of hot. I guess, like, how much can sex change really over the decades?
What? I feel comfortable presuming that sex in 1930 was on average quite different to how sex looks approaching 2030.
Really doesn't seem it.
Like, okay.
Like female pleasure is in this. It's not just about men.
Yeah.
And we think that we invented like female pleasure. Turns out it was like orgasms for women were around in the 1930s. And I can see the influence of this book on, like, I love the TV show Girls, and it was so interesting to read this book and think about Girls and think about how groundbreaking it was. And it was groundbreaking in a lot of ways, but also how completely ordinary Girls was as well. And the things that were addressed in Girls were being written about, talked about, experienced decades and decades ago as well.
I love it when you stumble across some piece of culture that you didn't realize was a critical part of the jigsaw or origin story.
You can see the influence of this everywhere today of this book.
Wow.
And so, so that was The Group by Mary McCarthy. There must be so many editions of this, and it's probably quite a famous book in some circles, but I'd never heard of it.
Wow, great.
And
Cool.
and the other book I read was a memoir by and it came out this year, by an English woman called Octavia Bright, who hosts Literary Friction.
Yes.
You know,
I do know like her and her work with that show, which is obviously amazing, but I haven't heard much about this book.
Yeah, so she wrote a memoir. God, she's an extraordinary writer, just the most beautiful writer. And it's a memoir called This Ragged Grace, and it is about the first 7 years of her sobriety. She got sober in her 20s, and it covers the first 7 years of that. And also pretty much around the time she got sober, her father started showing signs of dementia. And in that 7 years was diagnosed with Alzheimer's specifically, and it follows his deterioration over the years, and she has so much love for him. And so does her mother. Like they seem like they were a great couple. Octavia's an only child, which I think is its own unique challenge, especially when a parent gets sick, and not having siblings around who understand understand the depth of your love and your parent and can help support you through it. She has her mum, but you are on your own in a way with that, even though she's got incredibly loving family and relationships and all that. It would be quite isolating in its own way. And so she has a really unique perspective on that. And when she's writing about her first 7 years of sobriety, it is not really about how she gave up drinking or what it was like not to drink, at social events or not to drink in. It was more about her diving deep down into herself in those 7 years and how she identifies as an alcoholic. And when she stopped drinking, she really got to know herself properly. So it's not so much about being sober, although obviously that is key. It is about getting to know herself and who she is, what she really thinks, what she feels, what drives her. And at the same time, watching her father, who was a brilliant man intellectually, by the sounds of it, deteriorate and become so vulnerable and someone who needs around-the-clock care. And it's not a spoiler to say he dies. Like, from the beginning, Alzheimer's is a terminal diagnosis. You just don't know exactly how long you've got. It can be years. And when you get to the end and he dies, I sobbed reading her description of it and reading her description of her grief and what she felt she lost when she lost her father. Like, it is so beautiful, a really, really beautiful memoir.
God, that sounds extraordinary. And also sounds different to a lot of the, on the internet in particular, millennial generations writing about their relationship with alcohol or writing about trying to get sober or trying to drink less. I feel like that's a conversation that's really happening at the moment in the last few years, but not in the way that you just framed what this memoir does.
It's like writing about alcohol and your relationship with it is quite zeitgeisty. You're right.
Yeah,
like
I think
there
so.
is a lot of literature out there about it, but I find that and it can be really interesting, but most of it is about the challenge of stopping drinking.
Yes.
What you feel you're missing out on, and then your acceptance and how much happier you are now that you've stopped. And she has a much more intellectually rigorous take on it, and it's more about her relationship with herself, and alcohol almost like barely features, to be honest, although she does talk about the rooms and being in meetings, but it's all kind of on the periphery of how she's feeling about it, about herself and her life.
I would read that. I got a bit, I don't want to say tired of the sort of zeitgeisty writing about people's relationships with alcohol, because I would never ever want to minimize how huge a deal that is, obviously, and how much so many people struggle with it. But when it did really become this zeitgeisty thing, I felt like I was reading very, very many only slight variations on a theme of, in particular, like booze is part of the culture, and especially in Australia, we have this culture of drinking, and the single biggest obstacle to me being able to reduce or stop drinking is how much everyone says I'm a buzzkill at parties.
Yeah.
And it was just like, I just felt like I read that 20 times.
Exactly that. And you read and it almost like a diary 20 times of like, it was hard and then it was easy.
Yes.
And I'm happy that I've done it now. Yeah. And isn't alcohol everywhere?
Yes.
And then also, even on the flip side of that, I also got a bit bored with, there was kind of a smaller trend, which I think is fading at the moment, of, you know, the hedonistic tales and telling your drunk, writing about your drunk stories, or like the crazy things that you've done with when you were drunk. And, you know, it's a lot. I do like the memoir, Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton. I did enjoy it. But I also was a bit bored by the end of like, then I got drunk and did this crazy thing.
Yeah. Also, I can't really relate. Well, I don't know. Like,
I can relate to the hedonistic aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I don't not party, but at some level, it would just be rare that I would read writing like that and feel moved in any particular way, even actually entertained.
It is super interesting to see how viral the articles go, though. Like,
why?
Still,
what do
when
people love?
People write about, I think that a lot more people than we realize have a complicated obviously people are relating to it, and a lot more people than we realize have a complicated relationship with alcohol, and but they don't feel that they're the stereotype of like some drunk under a bridge drinking out of a paper bag. And I think that's why it cuts through.
Yeah, fair enough.
People relate to it. And also, well, we're all just super nosy, aren't we? We just love reading about I love reading about other people's problems, whatever they are.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
And what their lives are really like.
Yeah. But to just go back to this Octavia Bright memoir, I also am thrilled to hear about how good this is, and it makes me really want to read it, because that podcast is so good, and those two co-hosts, this is talking about literary friction, and those two co-hosts have been sort of voraciously reading widely and reading deeply for so many years and interviewing so many authors, and have built such a profile in the literary sort of industry, media landscape, whatever. I'm sure that either of them could have, like, I feel confident in presuming that either of them could have sort of gotten book deals about something, this thing, anything for several years now. And it makes me really happy to hear how good Octavia Bright's book ended up being, rather than, I just think that it's like there could have been some easy route where it was like a collection of essays about like reading in my life that was just sort of this.
Absolutely, yes.
Am I making sense? Like, it could have just been this.
No, you totally make sense. Or a collection of essays would be the most obvious thing. Or just a memoir that tells a series of events in your life rather than doing the
digging
dive into yourself. And because of how well read she is and how amazing she is, there are a lot of literary references in this, and also a lot of references to different types of philosophy.
Beautiful.
Which she applies to her life in different ways, and takes from it and then doesn't take from it. But very accessible. Like even if you've never heard of the philosophers she's talking about, she explains it in a way that is engaging but not like a Wikipedia entry, and then quickly takes you right down into how it applies to her life.
Oh, beautiful.
She's done an amazing job. This definitely isn't a memoir that she got a book deal in January and handed it in October.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work and a lot of thought. Also, it seems from it, a really voracious note taker. And so I think that she had a lot of notebooks that she drew on for the 7 years as well, and that really serves the book too.
Well, that leads us to this funny subject that you want to talk about.
Yeah, the article that I saw people talking about this week, which I thought was very interesting, was about Hadrian's daily events calendar being found. The Emperor Hadrian, who was emperor for 2 decades in Rome, very influential.
Very influential.
He built the Pantheon himself. No, he oversaw the building of the Pantheon and other very key ruins and important shit like that. You can see I'm really passionate about his realm.
Hadrian.
That's not why I find him interesting. Obviously, Hadrian's Wall, I think, is the most famous thing that people would know. But this is what I love is about this story is they found his daily events calendar, and I think that's so cool. It was found in this archaeological park near Rome that used to be a harbour, and they're marble slabs that have been carved into, and they reckon that it was a very senior religious figure who was keeping his daily events calendar for him. They're dated to the year 128 AD.
Oh,
isn't that crazy?
Goosies. I fucking love history.
Yeah, that you can. Isn't that crazy that we've got someone's calendar from 2,000 years ago?
That is so sick.
And
I want everything. I want their meal planner. I want
same.
I want their inspirational quotes log. I want
their bullet journal. Yeah. I would love their meal planner.
I would love Hadrian's bullet journal.
And on this is how detailed his daily events calendar was. They can pin it to actual date. So it's 10th of January. They've pinned something to the January 10.
Oh my God.
How incredible is that?
This is
And
great.
so on the 10th of January, Hadrian received the title Pater Patriae. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I don't know how many fluent Latin, ancient Rome listeners, experts we have. So he received the title, and so he gave money to the people to celebrate it. He gave a gift to people.
Thanks, Hadrian.
Yeah. On 11th of April, he went to Africa.
Travel journal.
Yeah, it's like a travel journal. Isn't that amazing to think that? But these are things that you could put into a leader's diary today. Isn't that incredible to think how much changes and how much stays the same? Like you could have a leader being today saying, oh yeah, on 10th of January I received this title, although that would probably more apply to ones that have more old school monarchy systems. And on 11th of April I went to Africa. Yeah, that'd be in someone's diary today.
What? Okay, so in the year 2123, 100 years from now, someone discovers Bridie Jabor's. Is it a diary? Is it a journal? Is it a planner? What are they?
I've
what
got a shared calendar. My shared calendar with my husband.
But it has to be corporeal. Like it has to be tactile.
Well, I actually always wonder what's going to be left of our digital traces and what people are going to be able to access digitally in 100, 200, 300 years. Do you know what I often think about is my grandchildren or great-grandchildren being able to go into some cloud and access their grandmother's, archived Instagram and what they would think about that.
So I don't want to, we'll get back to this very interesting conversation, but I found out recently that the US for a while have had this policy about accumulating and just gathering data that has come from encrypted platforms where people think that they're sharing things, photos, messages, whatever it is, across many different platforms, where individuals think that that information is not able to be accessed by the government. The government are like combing and hoarding that data, even though they cannot right now decrypt it, because they believe that at some point in time in the future, they will be able to decrypt it.
And you would assume that they can.
Everything.
Well,
but like when you said that, like if your great grandkids or whatever, it's not inconceivable that every single thing we have ever said and done online would be accessible somehow.
Exactly. And would it be a bigger invasion of my privacy by my grandchildren or great-grandchildren to go in and find my Instagram archive, to go in and find my messages is a mortifying thought.
Yeah.
Although a lot of them are very silly. To hear my voice, do you know what they could listen to? My voice notes. Imagine being able to go back and hear your great-grandmother's voice and how she was talking to her friends and the gossip she was relaying. Isn't that incredible? But is that a greater invasion of privacy than when we get out, you know, it used to be very common in some classes and amongst certain people, to write in a diary every single day.
See,
and is it a bigger invasion of privacy that, you know, when people die, we read their diaries? Would we read Nana's diaries?
I have strong feelings about this. Overseas, in particular, in like the US and the UK, in the antiquarian book trade and sort of in the kind of literary antiques area, it's very common and completely acceptable to buy and sell letters that people have sent each other through history. And I find the commercial exchange of private correspondences not okay with me. I think that there's something really it's an invasion of privacy. But I also, like, my partner is under extremely strict instructions that if I pass away unexpectedly and have not been able to do this myself, he is to burn everything. I don't.
Why are you keeping it if you want it burnt?
Because because of what you just said about how extraordinary Octavia Bright's book is, because she has all these journals to draw from.
So that you can create your own book.
I teach about this and I think about this all the time, about what an extraordinary personal archive I am creating. I am creating a library of my own experiences and thoughts and feelings that I can then draw from at any future date, for fiction or nonfiction. But that's for me.
You don't want anyone else to read it, even
no.
Even though our access to other people's diaries and letters is what makes history so rich.
Yeah, but what makes that's like how some people get more famous than other people, is because we have their archives. And I am profoundly uninterested in being famous.
Well, it's not just about being famous, but it's sure some people are more famous because they kept diaries and their archives became more accessible. But also it can be a real gift to other people and next generations and help us understand a time better and understand how things were for certain type of people and give us a sense of history and connection, human connection through the decades.
Yeah.
One of the most obvious examples, I guess, is Anne Frank's diary.
Yeah, for sure.
We'd be poorer if that wasn't made public. And I'm sure that 14-year-old teenager would be completely mortified to have her diary. And there's some pretty sexy thoughts in that diary, which is completely normal and reasonable
for a 14-year-old.
Yeah, but can you imagine as a 14-year-old knowing that those thoughts are going to be read by millions of people? But what a contribution to society and to us that they were made public.
Bridie, you're not wrong. It just makes me uncomfortable. Or so here's maybe a difference. I completely agree with everything you've just said about Anne Frank and how much richer we are for having that record, both in the sense of it being an objective record about things that were happening at the time, but also a deeply personal and subjective record of what it felt like to be her at that time. Yes. I think what irks me more is when the letters and private correspondences of famous people are bought and sold for money without their permission. Surely there's like a difference there somehow.
I guess there is a difference, but how are they then used? It still usually means they're made public or people can access them to write books and
I don't
about
think
history.
That's different though. That's like a process of archiving and like librarianship access, etc. For example, I remember a few years ago, Germaine Greer sold her entire archive
And didn't read it properly before she sold it.
and then got real cut about the book that came out from the person who had accessed those archives to write about her life. And I mean, I certainly think you can't have it both ways. You can't like sell all your stuff and then hope to indefinitely somehow kind of be able to control the narrative that gets written about you, right?
Totally. Well,
But if you want to keep it private and if you don't want those diaries or those letters ever to be made public, I there's something in me that says that we need to honor that.
Yeah, but then Queen Victoria had these incredible daily diaries that
Queens
would have
don't
given
count.
such an
We've talked about
insight.
that. Kill
Yeah, but
them
they don't
all.
count.
I don't care.
And her daughter burnt them.
Yeah, good.
No,
Oh.
we need access to that. We've lost a big part, like a big record of history because her daughter burnt so many of her freaking diaries.
Okay, look, the historian in me agrees with you and that is an act of like cultural devastation. The woman in me cringes.
What are you so afraid of getting out? I really want to read your diaries.
Went to Africa.
Yeah.
Got an award.
I'm not like a daily diary keeper. I have interesting records. Like at different times in my life, I've kept regular diaries and I keep a diary on and off. And I also record a lot of thoughts and happenings in various Google documents.
Yeah.
Also the Notes app of my phone. I think the Notes app of people's phones would be among the most revealing things that you could read about them, maybe even more revealing than their daily diary.
Yeah.
Because when you're making a daily diary, there is an element, I think anyway,
Performance.
of performance to it, even though it's meant to be just for you. You're still trying to write well or have a good sentence, or even like I am so funny in my diaries for like no one but me. I'm like, who am I making these jokes for? And these like pithy little observations.
I love that.
But the notes on your phone that you're like jotting down throughout the day, much more raw and revealing.
Every other app and platform is a performance, but the Notes app is the truth.
Exactly. My only directions are, I don't think my husband Matt would be that bothered by my diary. I feel like my husband would read my diaries and be like, yeah, I already knew what she thought. I was there when this happened. Yep, I was there. Yep, I was there. Yep, knew that. Yep,
oh, that's
heard her
funny.
say that. Yeah. Oh, very funny of her. But I've told one of my close friends, GW, that if I were to die suddenly, especially because I did have a near-death experience a couple of years ago and it did make me think a lot about this stuff. I said to her, if I were to die suddenly or in an accident, could you come over and just go through my diaries and stuff and just put away anything that I wouldn't want like other people to read or people I love to read. I'm not worried about upsetting her or offending her or her misinterpreting anything, especially in the fog of grief. But I'm like, there are some things that maybe other people don't need to read or know.
I think that's like something that makes me nervous is that you could be like struggling with let's say a relationship, and it could be like with a sibling or a partner or a parent, and you write about it either once in a way that sounds strong or you write about it recurringly just because you're trying to work through it. And then somebody else comes along and misreads that and then misinterprets
exactly
it. Like,
right. And if you're a sporadic diary keeper, what motivates you to write?
Yeah,
when you're angry,
or
when
sad,
you're upset
or confused,
and that's why it would seem in my diaries maybe I was more upset with some people or angrier or maybe just meaner than what I actually am. It isn't the full my full thoughts about anything or anyone. And so that's particularly why I would want someone to go through them and just be like, and maybe people could read them in 2 years, but certainly not in the immediate aftermath of my death. I wouldn't want grieving people to think that's what I actually
Yep.
thought of them. Although I would love to see the book that my middle sister would write with my diaries. She could look at them and she can write a biography of me and paint a portrait of me with she'd be ruthless.
Although this relates back to the episode we did the other week where we were talking about how we only know what we do about what's George Orwell's wife's name?
Eileen.
Eileen. That we only know as much we do about her because one of her mates kept that.
Yep. Two mates.
Two
mates kept records. Exactly. So you could be erasing women with your diaries being burnt, Bri. Think about that. Call yourself a feminist.
I've been accused of a great many things. I've never been accused of erasing women. All right, the biggest story of the week this week is about trees because everyone saw the same video, which was a video filmed from the back of someone's car, filming a truck driving ahead of them, and the truck had a gigantic, huge, colossal tree chopped down, strapped to the back of the truck being transported. And I think maybe it was probably naive of me, but I thought, and this was in Tasmania, I should say, I thought we didn't do that anymore. And I think a lot of people were shocked to see this old wood being chopped down.
That tree is absolutely centuries old.
Yeah.
And yes, we are still chopping down centuries old trees. It is still happening. And it's not being surveyed properly. So the way that we're finding out about this isn't the first time that we've found out about centuries old tree and trees being logged in Tasmania because of a citizen seeing them on the back of a truck.
Yep.
And this was in the logging coup in the Florentine Valley. The Liberal Premier Jeremy Rockcliffe has said that they've got protected areas in Tasmania. They've got well-developed procedures to protect. He is not particularly concerned about this. And Sustainable Timber Tasmania.
We both flagged the same line in this article. The state-owned agency formerly known as Forestry Tasmania, now rebadged as Sustainable Timber Tasmania.
Incredible rebranding.
Such rebranding.
Said it was felled for safety reasons, but didn't go into what those safety reasons were. Alice Hadrian is a campaigner for Wilderness Society. She says that Sustainable Timber Tasmania says it doesn't log giant trees, but every other week they see them on the back of trucks and then they go into the coup and they find the stumps as well. You can always find evidence of it too. And so she's calling for better surveying because the only reason that we're finding out about this or knowing about it is basically like citizen scientists and campaigners going and finding them. There doesn't seem to be much political will to fix it, but it is a very, very complicated issue in Tasmania as well where it employs a lot of people.
Yep. So when I saw these stories, I thought immediately of this book I read a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now. It's called Damnation Spring by Ash Davidson, and it's set in California, and it's set sort of a few decades ago when they were still really, like, I don't know how much they do it now, but it's set in this place called Damnation Grove, and it's a community where the majority of the men are employed in logging. And, you know, Rich Gunderson is the sort of, it's set around a particular family, Rich Gunderson, and his wife Colleen. And Rich is a logger, and his father was a logger, and his father's father was a logger. And you're talking about a time and a place where it's still very much the setup that the man goes out and makes a living to bring home, like it's a single income family and all the families around are sort of single income families. And I mean, like, huge trigger warning for anyone struggling with fertility issues. But what happens in the book is that Colleen and Rich end up on opposite sides of this battle and argument because Colleen is desperate for a second baby and starts believing, for, you know, what we can now see as very valid reasons, that the extreme logging and the chemicals they're using to sort of burn out undergrowth from growing back are going into the local water supply. And she's drinking that local water supply, and she's just having all of these miscarriages. And it just goes through, and none of that is huge spoiler, like that's all kind of explained, that setup in the blurb. But what it does is show those real and valid like sort of class issues, whereby it's not always as simple as just saying stop logging if there's no alternative for what these people are going to do for work. And when I first read it, what I thought was how analogous that struggle is to mining in so many communities and towns in Australia. But then what I also thought about this week when I saw that video and read all this stuff about logging in Tasmania was how it has always been the case that the people fighting to stop this environmental devastation are just always the ones that get branded as the like idiot hippie dreamers who sort of don't know about the sort of what realities or economics of the way the world works. And that language and that sort of dismissive attitude we have now is just exactly the same one that has been perpetuated for decades by people who benefit from the status quo.
Yeah, and it's so interesting as well because they can be dismissed as hippies who are living in, a dream, a fantasy land and not in reality, when they're the most grounded in reality because trees are not an infinite resource.
Yep.
And a lot of people seem to treat them as such. Like if you cut down a tree that's 500 years old, it's going to take 500 years to regenerate that. If you cut down a tree that's even 50 years old, like those trees need to be planted and grow so that we can have them, in many years. So I don't think that this issue's been properly fixed, although there has been progress in the past few years. And in Victoria and Western Australia, they've both committed with solid dates to ending native logging, which is a huge step forward. In Tasmania, the other really interesting issue that's happening with logging there is all the illegal logging.
Yeah.
Which the writer Sophie Cunningham has done some great journalism on this, and I'll link to a couple of her pieces and interviews in the show notes. And she has investigated something that I didn't really have much of an idea about how prevalent the illegal logging is. And what that is people usually going in at night, and it's really hard to prevent and it's really hard to police because of how big the forests are. So you can't have eyes on all trees at all times. They go in at night and they take down trees. They sell the timber to some mills mills aren't always great at tracing the origins of their timber, but they also sell them on Facebook Marketplace, the timber from these trees. And they are cutting down trees that are 500 to 800 years old.
But this is analogous to the struggles with poaching overseas when they talk about like how impossible it is to protect, like, say, rhinos, like across the plains. You're talking about just like huge square kilometers needing coverage.
And cowboys who are intent on doing it. And what Sophie has reported that's really interesting is that the illegal logging has got really, really bad in Tasmania in the past 2 years, and they think that is linked to the cost of living crisis.
Yep,
and the reason that more trees are being illegally logged. But she says these people don't know how to cut down trees. So sometimes they're not actually very skilled. So they go in the middle of the night. It's widely believed and understood that drugs are involved to an extent because it's a really, really difficult job to cut down a tree. And you're doing it late at night. Like some of these people need substances so that they're able to do that kind of physical work.
What the fuck?
Yeah. It's tied up in so many different issues. It's really fascinating. And they cut down the trees. They either cut them down poorly, so they end up like wrecking other trees. Yeah. You know, the tree falls and wrecks other trees. They do it in habitats of endangered animals and don't care. And, you know, they find endangered owls and endangered possums around these trees. They give up chopping the tree. So they've like damaged it irreversibly and it's going to have to come down, but they don't even end up taking it or finishing the job. So it's just like mindless vandalism to a degree. And another interesting thing is it happens in these really tiny communities.
They would know.
So people know who it is. But because you're all so close, so you see them at the pub, you see them in the shops, and there are people really passionate about the preservation of these trees. And then there are people doing this illegal logging, and they know who each other are. And they have fines, but apparently it can be so lucrative or people are so desperate for money that they cop the fines as the cost of doing business.
Yep.
So they get caught, they get fined, and then they just go back in again and keep doing it.
Yeah, this is like, if anyone is listening to this and finds it fascinating, you should read Damnation Spring by Ash Davidson, because it's set in a small community and it like drives a huge gulf between two sides of the community when people start asking difficult questions about logging, even legal logging. But there's also this undercurrent of illegal logging happening because the sort of higher ups in the federal government are starting to try and bring in laws to protect certain, especially old trees. And then some people who have big families to feed are like, fuck it. And what is also interesting, and this is not an original insight, is to sort of reflect on the intersection of sort of like patriarchy / toxic masculinity and environmentally devastating practices, because there is something about the logging described in Damnation Spring where part of it's like a point of pride that these men are so strong and do such sort of deliberately dangerous work and do such powerful work, like the way the language around like bringing down a, beast of, like it's all, I don't know, it's part of their identity as well, very clearly, in this sort of really messy, inextricable way of sometimes being good because they are working hard and providing for their families, and sometimes being bad because they are dominating the landscape.
And it wasn't the only tree in the news this week, actually. The other, in Victoria, the Jabrung birthing trees were in the news again. So this is a battle and a story there that's been going on for 4 years, where the Victorian government wanted to clear these really culturally significant trees. And we haven't even got into that in Tasmania as well. Like, it's devastating for the ecosystem. It's devastating for the environment. It's devastating for endangered animals. It's also devastating culturally.
Yeah.
For the Indigenous people there, what's happening. Like, you still have trees there where you can see the canoes that were thoughtfully carved out of the trees, and they're just being chopped down without a thought, particularly by illegal loggers. And then in Victoria, there's been this battle. They've saved 250 of these birthing trees, and these trees have been around for centuries, and it's where the Jabrung women would go to have their babies, and they've been doing that for centuries. They've saved 250 of them, but the government is still fighting with the Aboriginal representative group of that area about what other trees to save and what can and can't be chopped down, and they have bulldozed some as well. But it's all in court now. It's been dragged out for years. And someone vandalized one of the sacred trees, which kind of blew my mind, being that passionate about a highway being built, and they spray painted on it, build the road. And more worryingly, they also 3 drill holes were found in it, so they think the tree might have been poisoned as well.
Oh my God.
Which is devastating, but brings that battle back into the news, and we still don't have a resolution on exactly which trees are going to be saved and which aren't. And if I still remember this piece, and I read it maybe a couple of years ago, from the writer Nayuka Gori, who's Jabrung, and they wrote about the trees as their inheritance. And it's so powerful. It was in The Guardian. I'll link that in the show notes. And it's one of the pieces that really crystallized what they mean to the people who have been looking after them for thousands of years, really.
And you made the point earlier too that the only reason these haven't already been bulldozed is because of the protests. Because of the, like, we just watched that.
Community action. They camped out there, yeah.
Yeah, we watched a short clip to make sure that we got the pronunciations right. And it was a tent embassy. And that is like one of the most consistently sort of powerful sort of civilian public actions. And it just goes back to this point about how civilian action can and does make a real difference, and it is nothing new that it is dismissed, and yet it is effective.
And not only dismissed, but there are various state governments at the moment
anti-protest laws.
Introducing
Huge.
and in the process of introducing anti-protest laws. In Victoria, there's some anti-protest laws being introduced and may already be in effect where a protester can be fined $20,000.
So cooked.
Which would be obviously financially devastating for many, many people, but still people doing it and trying to save them. So we will be watching that with interest, how it goes in Victoria with the preservation of these sacred birthing trees, and also what happens in Tasmania, because it's an ongoing issue. What is logged, what is not logged, what is protected, what is not protected, and how they decide what is protected, because it can be quite arbitrary, such as the height of a tree being 85, anything over 85 metres they classify as a giant tree. And there are lots of trees in that group that are 83 metres.
Far out. Okay, the final thing we want to talk about this week that has happened that I find very, very interesting is the collection of 50 or so authors who co-authored a letter to the Edinburgh Literary Festival, not threatening to boycott this year's festival, which is sort of happening or has just happened, but saying that if the festival doesn't stop receiving sponsorship money from, like, basically dirty money from companies that make profits from investments that exacerbate the climate emergency,
such as fossil
fuels. These authors have basically put the festival on notice and said that if it's not amended, they will all boycott next year. They did it in response to our legend Greta saying that she was boycotting this year's festival because of this particular fossil fuel company. And the responses sort of publicly have been interestingly mixed to this. So one of the big names, for example, was Zadie Smith signing this letter. And the festival replied sort of saying, let's talk about it, and that the company they all named was not as bad as people made it sound out to be. It's Bailey Gifford, who, like, I mean, I'm not a business investment person, but Bailey Gifford do make millions and billions of dollars from profits from fossil fuel companies, but it does only represent a single-digit percentage of their profits. But, like, I don't know that really makes any difference. But then the challenge, obviously, is that is one of the major funders of the festival. And I read this letter to the editor in The Guardian from overseas. The arts are constantly searching for the untarnished penny to be funded. And the untarnished penny, like, does it exist? Like, where do you get clean money from?
Which is a fair point, but also you have to reckon with the fact that these companies are not sponsoring arts festivals out of the goodness of their hearts, or because they're particularly passionate about the arts. Like, it is always part of a corporate strategy that their end goal is to make their image look better, and look good, And so when you take their money, you are allowing that strategy to work, and you are giving legitimization even by stealth, or you're not coming out in clear support of this company and declaring they're the best company in the world, but it is still giving them good press and a good image.
And it's part of a bigger thing, right, as well, where we learned from a lot of people's extraordinary reporting, but in particular Patrick Radden Keefe's book, Empire of Pain, about the Sackler family who made, millions and billions of dollars from the opioid, like basically starting and exacerbating and catalyzing the opioid crisis in America, and how they have so many wings of museums and galleries in their name, and how they purchased with this sort of blood money a cultural sort of shield, like an armor of legitimacy and esteem, and
it all helps to protect them from being properly criticized and held to account.
And I think the particularly ironic thing that is valid for the authors to point out is that writers' festivals are the place often where these, like, where it's the perfect forum for people to be able to criticize inaction on the climate emergency. And so many of those authors write about trying to hold governments to account and trying to hold corporations to account. And the question is, I think there's, like, obviously I don't want anyone to take dirty oil money. But if a festival can't go ahead, or if a festival has to significantly, seriously scale back and lay people off, which the Edinburgh Literary Festival apparently in recent years had to do, like redundancies and reducing capacities. If there's no longer a platform where those difficult conversations can be had by anyone, well, then how is that helping the cause? Does that make sense?
It does, but also Edinburgh Literary Festival having to scale back and make redundancies in the past few years. I don't think it's because, fossil fuel money was so key to their existence and more about the global health pandemic. And if they're trying to frame it as a struggle for funding when in fact they've been hit massively by COVID just like every other festival, and that's more of a factor.
Right.
Then we shouldn't accept that as a
I agree.
excuse.
Right. But if, let's say hypothetically, the Edinburgh Literary Festival make no changes between this year and next year and keep taking dirty oil money, they then have 50 really big names who will no longer attend the festival. There will, if those 50 stick to their guns, which I believe they would, there would probably then be a domino effect where other potential participants are sort of also then in solidarity boycott as well, and like a kind of ghost shadow festival takes place. Is that what it takes? I'm exhilarated by how much that might make festivals and cultural institutions around the world shit their pants. Like, obviously there's the kind of protest part of me loves that, but in the meantime, it's just sad to think of what would be lost, right?
Well, I also trust that the festival can go out and do a big part of their job, which is fundraise and lobby for sponsorship from places.
Right. So when they say that they can't afford to go ahead without oil money, you don't believe them?
No, absolutely not. I do not take that at its word.
Oh, okay. So that's where our misunderstanding has come from. I believed them. Oh, I'm so stupid.
No, you're not stupid, but I guess it's supremely subjective for both of us about what we accept and what we don't accept, and it's, you are taking them at their word, but I just think there's always another way around.
Yeah, and I mean, I should say,
work on that.
I should say, like, I would have signed it.
The letter?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course. Thanks so much for listening. This has been Cool Story with Bri and Bridie. Please find us on Instagram at Cool Story, Bri Bridie. Send us any messages there. We read them all. We respond to almost all of them, and we love hearing from you.
Let us know what you think. Do you want people to burn your diaries, or would you like them to live in perpetuity in a museum? Send us your thoughts.
Want to hear a cool story? Find us wherever you get your podcasts.